Well, I hope you all enjoyed the Andalusia, St Katharine's Dock, the life of Charlotte Ann Lydia Everton, and the Dickens Inn. And for me, on a personal level, I've saved the best till last, the Ivory House. Here is its main gateway here, and you can see you're left in no doubt by what was taken into the ground floor and first floor. The upper floors were used for shells and other precious things, and the vaults, which I'm interested in below, were used for the storage of fine wines and rum. So you'll join me over the road as we go through the Elephant Gateway towards the Ivory House. We'll get some exterior views, catch up on some of its history. There we are. We have crossed over the road. St Katharine Docks. And we will now go through the elephant flanked gateway. Through the gateway my great grandfather and great grandfather, both called Charles Lee, would undoubtedly have walked. Now, you'll join me looking at the building at my favourite angle while we catch up on some of its history. And here we are, looking at the building from my favourite angle of it. Here you see its clock tower, and here its bell tower, still retaining a bell, and that bell would have been rung daily to mark the start and end of the men's shifts, also to mark if any emergencies took place. Now we'll get some of the history of Ivory House. Ivory House was built in 1858 and is the only original warehouse still standing in St Katharine Docks. It was restored to its current state in 1973 and today houses a mixture of shops, restaurants and high-end luxury apartments with stunning city views. This original warehouse became popularly known as the Ivory House due to the vast quantities of ivory that passed through it on its first and ground floors. At its peak in the 1870s, nearly 200 tons of ivory covered its floors annually, amounting to almost 4,000 dead elephants. Aside from ivory, the warehouse also handled other luxury imports, such as perfume, shells, which were dealt with on the upper floors, and wine and rum, which were dealt with in the expansive basement vaults. Until the late 19th century, London was the principal importer of ivory. 500 tons were imported into the capital every year, mainly from the east and west coasts of Africa. Smaller tusks were sent to India to make bangles and toys and board games. The larger, softer tusks were stripped and shipped to famous carving centres in Germany and France, where they were carved into ornate pieces such as crucifixes, paper cutters and delicate napkin rings. London itself used the ivory to produce piano keys and billiard balls. There was also a thriving industry in Sheffield, making elegant cutlery handles. Most of these were luxury items made for the elite of Victorian England and the rest of Europe as symbols of affluence. England's trade in ivory is slightly older than its trade in slaves. It was first brought to England in the 1600s, along with gold from West Africa. At this time, trade was still quite primitive, and England's ivory imports were comparatively low at 5 tons a year. In this period, the aim of this trade was to buy cheap and sell dear. Merchants sought to obtain maximum gold and other valuables, such as ivory, as cheaply as possible, and then sell these items on in Europe at the highest possible price. By the early 1800s, Britain's growing technological superiority and the Industrial Revolution, the nature of the trade and the economy changed dramatically. Britain was no longer simply buying and selling the ivory, but instead it began to import ivory as a raw material and to process it into napkin rings and bangles, before selling these goods back to its own colonies and into continental Europe. This reaped a far greater return than simply trading in raw materials. The processing of raw ivory is just one example of what was happening in all spheres of the emerging capitalist society. The shells and things that were brought in were things like mother of pearl and abalone shell that would be used to decorate brushes, combs, furniture, all sorts. You'll see some historical images of what it was like on the inside of this back in its day. And the rum and wine and brandy, they speak for themselves really, brought in great big barrels, and there was interesting processes, rigorous ones, that went on in its keeping and upkeeping, as we'll find out as we go on. And here we see the front or main entrance of the building, and its rear where the restaurant things and whatnot, the utility areas back out onto and such like. Yeah, it's a very different world inside nowadays to what it would have been years ago. But I shall take you once again to, although we can pass my favourite part, old ventilation shafts for the cellars below. Vaulted cellars, I may add. You can hear the water pouring in down there, which is obviously somewhat of a problem. Being given our permission visit, you already joined me. It's closed now. They were stocking up early. The young fella was actually really nice, very obliging, because he's a fellow history enthusiast himself. So he was more than happy to oblige, and even took some photos of me and asked me to you know when you get people that spread their arms wide out in pictures, which I don't generally do as a rule, but I did it to oblige. I was quite pleased with this. But this is where you'll rejoin me in a little while as we go down into the vaults. Closer look at its bell tower. This clock does work well and keeps good time. And in here are things like little wine bars and restaurants. This is the Melusine seafood restaurant, Bravas Tapas, and they're like bow-fronted Georgian shops. They're really nice. Move away from there before we get copyrighted for the music. Really nice places. And this is obviously, having been down in the vaults where my ancestors worked, this is my second favourite area now. You see it goes right through there. And when we go through here, just pause you a sec. We go through here. Walking over its old flagstones. There's another wine bar there, wine bar and retail. Coming, of course, out onto a famous site. And those of you that may have missed your opportunity to get on this because it was advertised as leaving on the 6th, they've extended their stay and they now leave on the 14th. So if it's something you want to visit, get online and start booking your tickets. But this is the reverse side of the old Ivory House. off we go. With, in my archetypical style, one I filmed earlier. A lot of the pubs, bars and wine bars in London restock very early in the morning. I was lucky to catch that happening. Popped in, asked, and was given permission to film down in there. Now, when I emailed a few years ago, when I was on the finding all the information out about the lease, I was told, I'm sorry, we don't really allow that kind of thing. But please feel free to come along and have a look at the location, which obviously I'll put on my list. But I would have liked to have taken photos of it at least, but things change. It's possibly under new management now. Unleash your imagination and host extraordinary events in the brand new 400 capacity event space in the Docklands Vaults, which is just down there. All locked up in pitch black dark now, but this is where you all joined me earlier, down in the vaults. So, off we go.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll catch up with you on WhatsApp, please. Yeah, I'll let you know. Yes. All right. Take care. I can see you.
I love places like this. Thanks very much, I really appreciate that, it's very kind. And where my ancestor's story comes into this is through this man here and his father. This man here, marked with the blue arrow, is my great-great-grandfather, Charles Henry Lee, 1855 to 1918. You will see this picture again more towards the end of the video, but in a slightly better form, shall we say. But particularly linked to the Ivory House is his father, my great-great-great-grandfather. Sadly, there are no known images of my great-great-great-grandfather, Charles William Lee. This is his christening record, and he was christened on the 16th December 1827 at my favourite church of St Margaret's, Barking. He's the son of Henry and Mary Lee of Barkingside, and his father's occupation was a labourer. I know from other christening records from his brothers and sisters that the father's occupation was a farm labourer, and it would be the industrialisation of farming in the 1840s and 50s that would move my Lee ancestors from the land at Barkingside to East London and to Stepney and to working as labourers and dock labourers there. And that's where we next catch up with Charles Senior, with his marriage to my great-great-great-grandmother Sarah, which happened on August 24th, 1851 in St Dunstan's parish church in Stepney. And here we see the extract from the parish registers of their marriage entry. In 1851 Charles Senior was a labourer, but I know by the 1861 census that he was then a dock labourer, and we know from events that we will discuss that between 1861 and 1868 he'd become a wine and spirit porter employed in the cellars under the Ivory House. And this is the very thing we see here. The cellars beneath the Ivory House in this image dates from the 1870s, and to the left you see the gentlemen in their top hats who are the prospective buyers of these wines and spirits. Over to the extreme right you can see two other gentlemen being shown more things by a porter, very much like in the role of what Charles Senior would have been doing. So this is what he would have looked like and what his world would have been like. And if you notice, in the porter's hand he holds a thing, a little, what looks like a stick with a light on the end of it. They were little oil lamps that they carried around with them. And if you look back over to the left you can see the gentleman holding up the glass. These oil lamps would be lifted up and the clarity of the alcohol checked and things like that. So we get a glimpse into Charles's world. Some more images from St Katharine's Dock at the time Charles Senior and Junior would have been working there. And I know from research that in the 1860s and 70s, permanent employees and warehouse staff such as Charles Senior could earn between 25 and 35 shillings a week. Stevedores and skilled men who unloaded and offloaded the goods from ships could also command a higher wage. However, casual labourers and the younger labourers like Charles Jr., and we have to remember that most boys in those days and girls left school, if they went to school at all, around the age of 12. And we know from later records by Charles Jr. being able to sign his name that he was educated enough to do that. And we also know that Charles Senior was able to sign his name from the marriage certificate, so whether he went to a school of some form or not, or was just taught to write his name, we don't know. But Charles Jr. and casual labourers were only paid an average of 5p an hour, and unlike his father, their work was by no means guaranteed. And this is where the link comes in with Charles Lee Senior and why he had to leave St Katharine's Dock, or was made to leave St Katharine's Dock, because of his own actions, of course. But this is an extract from the East London Observer, 18th of June 1868. A matter of theft at the docks. On Friday last, Mr James Wilcott of Mile End Road, Mile End, Mr Charles Lee of Roscoe Street, Canning Town, and Mr Joseph Clark of Wapping High Street, Wapping, all men engaged as wine and spirit porters of the vaults below the Ivory keeping house at St Katharine's Dock, were apprehended in the act of stealing spirit from a great cask, an act known to the dock labourers as sucking the monkey. The men were apprehended by Mr Jackson, a foreman at the said keeping house. Taken before the management, each man agreed to remit a week's wage of 28 shillings and 10p. That's how we know how much Charles Senior was being paid. And to lose his place. Owing to their previous good character, the men are lucky not to have been taken before a magistrate. The sons of Mr Clark and Mr Lee, also in the employment of said house, and known to be of good character, are to keep their places, though we are in no doubt closely watched from hereinafter. So this little act of stealing the alcohol or sucking the monkey, which, as I discussed in our tour of St Katharine's Dock, encompassed drilling a hole into a barrel, or a great cask in this case, siphoning out the liquid into a cup or through a reed straw, and stealing it and drinking it. And that's what they got caught doing. And really, they were lucky not to have been taken before a magistrate. This was a very commonplace practice, and unless you had a bad character, it was generally treated as a minor misdemeanor. You'd lose your wage and lose your place, as in this case. So this action lost Charles Senior his job, which in turn would of course lose him his life. In those days, unlike today, your record would follow you everywhere. It was easy to bugger off to a new employment place and start again. He appears in the 1861 census as Charles Henry Lee, although he was Charles William Lee, so whether that was something dodgy or not, we don't know. But after he lost his job at St Katharine's, he moved on to the London docks as a corn porter, so it was a downgrade in his job, really. And here is an image for reference purposes of corn porters from the 1870s and 80s. And as we know, Charles's son stayed in the employment, but Charles moved on, and this is where we next catch up with him with another extract from a different newspaper. This one is the East London Advertiser, 4th of June 1870. Most unhappy accident at the London docks. On Wednesday, 2 days past, Mr. Charles Lee, a corn porter of Roscoe Street, West Ham, aged 42, was about his work of pushing trolleys under the chute within the grain warehouse at the London docks, where a most unfortunate accident occurred. Mr. Lee, in the action of pushing a trolley forward, slipped and fell, hurting himself. He cried out. The fellow above, Mr. Richard Cotton, believing he to have heard Mr. Lee's usual shout, pulled the lever, whereupon near on half a ton of wheat was loosed, unfortunately burying poor Mr. Lee quite alive. He was gotten out quickly, in an extreme state of shock. Mr. Lee was conveyed to the London hospital. Sadly, we can report that the condition did not improve, and Mr. Lee died at approximately 3:25 yesterday afternoon. His widow, Mrs. Sarah Lee, was present at the death. It seems that the cause was a most unhappy accident. An inquest will be held on Tuesday the 7th of June. East London Advertiser, 4th of June 1870. And here we see Charles's death certificate. This is one I got from the Family History Centre in 2005 in the course of my Lee research. And Charles died on the 3rd of June, so 3 days after his accident, in the London hospital, aged 42, occupation dock labourer. Cause of death was violent shock from being buried under some wheat, and the signature and description of the residence of the informant was information given from Mr. John Hudderston, it looks like, but it's quite hard to make out, coroner for Middlesex. Inquest held on the 7th of June. And unfortunately, the Middlesex records, coroner's records, for that era were all destroyed in an air raid in the Second World War, so we'll never know the full ins and outs of the inquest, but we know from the extract from the newspaper clipping Andy's death certificate and what happened. And Charles did leave a small estate, which his effects were under £50. I know from my other research that his effects all in all came to £48, 7 shillings and 9pence, which doesn't seem very much to us today, but for a dock labourer in those days that wasn't bad. And here we see Charles Lee, 27th of June, letters of administration of the personal estate and effects of Charles Lee, later 29 Roscoe Street, Canning Town, which incidentally enough would later on become Roscoe Road, in the county of Essex. Corn porter deceased, who died on the 3rd of June 1870 at the London Hospital, Mile End Road, in the county of Middlesex, were granted at the principal registry to Sarah Lee of 29 Roscoe Street, aforesaid widow, the relict, a term I absolutely detest, of the said deceased, she having first been sworn. Charles was buried in West Ham Cemetery, and interestingly enough, Sarah's mother had been buried in a common grave in West Ham Cemetery. And when Charles died, 3 years after Sarah's mother, this is his mother-in-law, Sarah purchased the grave as a private grave and had her husband buried in it. Unfortunately, obviously our family didn't know this story, and the grave wasn't maintained. After your 99 years is up, graves can be removed, and the grave was reused in the 1980s. Luckily to inform that they don't, in West Ham Cemetery, dig them up like that. They take away any stones that there may have been, and they use the spots in between the graves, so they'll dig a new grave in between old graves. So Charles and his mother-in-law will still be down there, just in amongst new burials. And that is where my family story comes into the Ivory House. And I did say you'd see this picture again in a better form, colourised this time. And here you see Charles Senior's son, Charles Jr., at his son's wedding, also called Charles, and below Charles Jr., marked with the arrow, is his wife, Henrietta. So they're my great-great-grandparents, and they're at their son's wedding. And as you can see, the date is the 31st of July 1904, and the address, Roscoe Road, Canning Town. So some 34 years later, after his father's death, it's nice to see that the family was still living in the same road. Whether it was still at number 29 or not, I don't know. I've not been able to ascertain that one, because of the street numbers changed when they changed it from Roscoe Street to Roscoe Road. But Charles Senior's granddaughter, my great-grandmother, the daughter of the man marked with the arrow here, she was born at Roscoe Road. So that was a nice bit of continuity. And that is what links my family to this amazing little place. And this is my good self, picture kindly taken for me. And this one, which is a pose I don't normally do, but there we are. I was obliging because I was obliged, and lovely young fella into his history as well. And this image shows some of the ships and boats that would have been bringing those barrels in, that Charles Senior would have been dealing with. His son, Charles Jr., when he was at St Katharine's, being in a much junior and younger role, he wouldn't have been as trusted as his father was. So what Charles was doing, we don't see Junior was doing, we don't quite know, but we do know he was in the employment of the said house. So, and that is the Ivory House, a lovely little picture that I took early in the morning. A beautiful building, and of course, because of its family ties, one I absolutely love. And its history of why it's called the Ivory House. And these are not pretty images to our age, of course, but as I said, on the ground and first floors in there, this is what it did from 1858 right until after the Second World War. And this image dates from 1922. The London warehouse was inundated with tusks from Africa. Ivory being weighed in 1922. Tusks being weighed before they were cut up for further use. Two men holding a large tusk before it is sold. And this, what you see here, a tusk being carved, would become the end products. Many things like it. This is just one of them. Mammoth tusks from Siberia arriving at the London docks. And what we have to remember is, in between the late 1860s and the 1880s, St Katharine's Dock would be amalgamated with the London docks, so they were all called the London docks. This image dates from 1924. 1934, and you can see the industry still very much flourishing. And the upper floors, as I said, were used for the storage of shells and perfumes and other precious things. And this is the process that you can see here with shells, abalone shells and mother of pearl, which were used for inlaying furniture and brushes and writing boxes and all sorts of things. And this, you can see that process in 1934 of what was stored on those floors. The building was restored in 1972, and this is the inside of the Ivory House. You can see it in its state of restoration to make it what it would become today, which is what you see here with some images that I've taken myself. These show the exterior of the Ivory House and its gates with the elephants flanking it. The front on of the Ivory House, of course. And this is its main foyer inside. And for £9,750 a month, you can rent this lovely apartment. There are service charges as well, my dears, so you will have to be comfortably off to afford this lot. This one, beautiful, aren't they? I love to see an old building that would either have been pulled down or just sat derelict for years, brought into the modern world in a way that retains a lot of the old. And that's a view from one of the balconies. And you'll now join me back on the ground. And that, ladies and gents, concludes our little series of the Ivory House, which once would have been a hive of industry, unfortunately taken in elephant tusks, also shells, perfume, rum, wine and other precious things. So I hope you found that interesting and our little series of what lies beneath. Thanks for watching.